All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our first video lecture. This is going to be on Chapter 5. We're going to try to review all the concepts of Chapter 5. You've read them in sections, so now this is one big summary of the entire chapter. So here we go. Here are the concepts that we're going to cover in this chapter and on this video lecture. Okay, Chapter 5 is on ecology, and ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other and with their non-living environment. That's key. So it's not only how organisms interact with living things, but it's also the non-living. So we have the biotic, which is the living component, and the abiotic, which is the non-living component. I hope you remember from your biology class that sponge is what makes up living organisms. So quickly turn to yourself and figure out what sponge stands for. Here we have the hierarchy of the ecological hierarchy, and you can see that there are biotic factors, so organisms and their interactions, as well as the abiotic factors, so energy, climate, weather, minerals, water, air, pH, salinity, temperature, soil, sunlight, etc., are all part of this ecosystem. So something to consider in ecology and ecosystems is limiting factors, and those factors are where they're limited or shortage of them or an absence of them results in less species success. So these factors can be either biotic or abiotic. So a biotic factor might be a certain plant or seed that an organism eats. Abiotic might be the amount of sunlight, the amount of dissolved oxygen, the amount of the soil temperature, etc. So those are all limiting factors, in particular like nitrogen for farmers. The range of tolerance is that range of conditions an organisms can survive, and those typically we're talking about pH and temperature. Here we have some vocabulary terms that you need to know. So there's the habitat and niche and species. So a habitat is the home, so the space an organism inhabits. It's defined as biological requirements for each particular organism. First is a niche. A niche includes all ways an organism impacts or affects organisms in which it interacts, as well as how it modifies the physical surroundings. So this is like the job of the organism, where the habitat is the home. Species is a category of organisms in which individuals within the group can potentially interbreed and produce viable offspring. So these are three terms you need to know. All right, I am so sorry that the formatting on this slide is so messed up, but we'll still talk through it. Producers are organisms able to make their energy from either the sunlight most of the time, but sometimes from heat. We have the photosynthesis equation, and yes, you must know it. So if you don't remember it from biology, here it is. C6 CO2 plus 6 water gives us C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus oxygen. So there's that equation. We also have NPP, GPP, which are net primary production and gross primary production. So in order to find the net primary production, NPP, we have to take the gross primary production number and subtract any amount of energy that was used for that organism to survive, and then what's left over. So if a plant has created 100 kilojoules of energy, but it needs 10 of those kilojoules for its own survival, there's only 90 kilojoules of energy left, and that would be net primary production. And then we have consumers. Consumers consume the organic matter and provide themselves with energy. So we have primary consumers, or herbivores. They eat the primary producers. We have secondary consumers who eat the primary consumers. And we have omnivores as another way of describing organisms that eat both plants and meat. Decomposers are an important role. These organisms digest organic molecules into an organic debris from decomposition of plants and animals into simpler organic compounds and absorb soluble nutrients, so bacteria and fungi. They use non-living but organic matter as a source of energy. So they are essential. Without decomposers, our world would be super smelly. Think about all the roadkill that wouldn't be decomposed. Keystone species are like the wolves in Yellowstone Park. They play a critical role in maintaining of specific ecosystems, and they add diversity to an ecosystem. So when they're removed, there's less diversity. Toad. So energy flow through an ecosystem, and each step of the flow of energy through an ecosystem is known as a trophic level. So as we move from one trophic level to a next, 90% of the useful energy is lost as heat. Cells use this energy for their own metabolism, so it's not available. And the second law of thermodynamics, which you must know, states that the energy changes shape and form and becomes less usable, or more unusable, So, as a result, only 90% of the available energy on the previous trophic level will be available at the next one. Because energy is difficult to track, biomass, weight of living material is often used to figure this out. And here we have an example of that energy pyramid. We have our producers, which is our first trophic level. We have our second trophic level, which are our primary consumers. We have our next trophic level, which are our secondary consumers, and then we have our tertiary consumers. And if you want to count the fourth trophic level, or decomposers, all coming off of that, because remember, decomposers decompose non-living but organic matter. So here we have two different terms, food chain and food web. Food chain is like a mouse eats a nut, and then the mouse is eaten by the hawk. It's one, and then the other, then the other. Food web is a series of multiple food chains. A single predator can have multiple prey species at the same time. The arrow always points to the direction the energy is going. So it's going in the direction of from the nut to the mouse. The arrow would be pointing towards the mouse. An example of a food chain. Notice it's not very complicated. And here we have an example of a food web. And notice the direction of the arrows, that it's always going from the person who's giving the energy to the person that's receiving the energy, or organism. And notice that this is super complex, and that a predator can have multiple prey. So this is why a food web is a better picture of the environment. Okay, natural selection and evolution. So you can't talk about change in species and change in habitat without talking about natural selection and evolution. Natural selection is the process that determines which individuals within a species will reproduce and pass on their genes. There have to be certain conditions in order for natural selection to occur. Individuals with a species show variation. These conditions are also that organisms within a species typically produce huge numbers of offspring, which most of them die. In addition to that, we have three more. We have excess number of individuals results in the shortage of species resources. Due to individual variation, some individuals have a greater chance of obtaining needed resources and thus have a greater likelihood of survival. And finally, as time passes, percentage of individuals showing favorable variations will increase and the percentage of showing unfavorable variations will decrease. This is what Darwin has laid out, and this is what the 5 tenets of natural selection are. So evolution is the change in kinds of organisms that exist and their characteristics, where speciation is the production of new species from previously existing species. So, for example, the Nevada yellow-legged frog is actually thought to be a new species as a result of dividing two populations in half and then isolating them. And then eventually there's a change over time. And when these two organisms come back together and they're not able to breed and produce a viable offspring, it is considered two species. So in addition to that, there's a few things to remember. That extinction is the loss of an entire species. So of the estimated 500 million species believed to have ever existed on Earth, 98 to 99% have gone extinct. And coevolution, 2 or more species can directly influence the evolution direction of each other. So this is also considered the race of arms. So when talking about organisms, we have to talk about the types of interactions. One of the most common types of interactions is predation or predator-prey. One of the animal obviously kills the other one. Predator benefits from the food, the prey is hurt, but prey adaptation is higher than reproduction rate. So what that means is that a prey is going to have to change, or there needs to be a mutation results in a change. Otherwise, the prey is going to run out of population for the predator. Prey species benefits by eliminating non-adapted genes from the gene pool. So those that are captured are the ones that can't escape the predator, and those that do escape the predator are able to then pass on their genetic information. And poorly adapted predators are less likely to obtain food and thus pass on non-adaptive genes. Here we have different sources of competition. We can have intra-specific competition or inter-specific competition. So intra is when two members of the same species are competing for the same resources, versus inter-specific competition is where you have two different species competing for resources. So when talking about competition, you have to remember the principle of competitive exclusion, which states that no two different species can occupy the same ecological niche or job in the same habitat at the same time. So you can't have that. So one of the species is going to have to either die and become extinct or move away, or they could have a mutation which results in some sort of adaptation which then gives them a slightly different leash, maybe if they're lucky. Otherwise, they will die. And then you want to talk about symbiotic relationship. So there's symbiosis, which is a close physical relationship between two different species, and at least one of the species derives benefit from the interaction. So we have parasitism, which is where one is positive and one is negative. Ecoparasites like fleas, or endoparasites like tapeworms. You can have symbiotic relationships like commensalism, where one organism benefits and the other is not. As you can see here, the shark is not benefited from this interaction. And finally, you can have mutualism, where both species benefit. In this case, the oxpeckers and the zebra both benefit. The zebra gets the little mites around it cleaned off, and the oxpecker gets food. So here we have a picture of all the different types of interactions, and as you can see up here in the chart, the species, depending on the type of interaction, might be harmed or benefit. So this is something you really want to be familiar with in going into the exam. Community and ecosystem. A community is an assemblage of all interacting species and organisms in the area, where an ecosystem is a system of interacting organisms, including their non-living surroundings, and that's important. So we're going to dive into the nutrient cycles of ecosystems. You didn't necessarily read this part of the textbook, but you're reading another text on it. So basically, nutrient cycles are organisms that are composed of molecules and atoms that are cycled between living and non-living portions of the ecosystem. This is why we say that energy flows in one direction and matter is constantly cycled. All the carbon that has ever existed on the planet still exists right now. It is not, we haven't recreated more carbon. All that has ever existed is still here. So it just changes form. Here we have the carbon cycle. Carbon and oxygen combine to form carbon dioxide. Plants use carbon dioxide during photosynthesis to produce sugars. Plants use sugars for plant growth. Herbivores eat the plants and incorporate molecules into their structure, and respiration breathes out the sugar, releasing CO2 and water back to the atmosphere. This is just a pretty basic, like, what does an animal do? And yet the carbon, there's no more carbon added, there's no carbon taken away, it's just changing form. Go ahead and look at this picture and try to come up with a situation for each of these phases: combustion, destruction of vegetation, photosynthesis, respiration, and diffusion in dead organisms. Follow the arrow and come up with a pathway for the carbon cycle. Nitrogen cycle, cycling of nitrogen atoms between abiotic and biotic ecosystems. Producers are unable to use the atmospheric nitrogen. The atmosphere is made up of nitrogen the most, and yet we can't use it. So we need to have something else change the form of that nitrogen into something that is usable. And the best use of that is nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which converts nitrogen gas into ammonia. Plants then can use that nitrogen to construct organic molecules. Those organic molecules are consumed by animals. Decomposers also break down nitrogen-containing molecules and releasing ammonia. The nitrogen cycle is something that is always on the exam for my class, but also on the AP exam, and it is something you have to know. So I'm doing a brief overview, but your reading from this weekend should really, really dive in deep, and you must know all the different phases. Phosphorus cycle gets talked about less, but it's still important. Phosphorus is composed of released by erosion and becomes dissolved in water. Plants use phosphorus to construct necessary molecules. Animals gain necessary phosphorus via herbivory, and decomposers recycle it back in the soil. So again, it's a cycle. Human impact on these nutrient cycles. Both activities cause significant changes in the carbon cycle, so burning of fossil fuels and converting forests into agricultural land. Fossil fuel burning also increased the amount of nitrogen available from plants. Fertilizer carried into aquatic ecosystems increases the aquatic plant growth rate and lowered oxygen concentrations. We'll get into this more. All right, that's the end of our video lecture. We will be talking about some of this stuff on the next time we see each other. All right, thanks.